distinguished and attentive listeners, there are moments when destiny writes its most scandalous chapters in the briefest of instants. Tonight, beneath the crystal chandeliers of Pemberton House, a single whisper would shatter more than crystal glasses. Between the rustle of silk gowns and the echo of dancing slippers, I invite you to witness with me how one evening's revelations would forever alter the course of three noble bloodlines. The autumn of 1847 painted London's most exclusive district in shades of amber and crimson, much like the secrets that burned within the hearts of its inhabitants. Pemberton House stood majestically on Grosvenor Square, its Georgian facade gleaming under the soft glow of gas lamps that lined the cobblestone streets. Tonight, the mansion's grand ballroom would host what society deemed the soirée of the season, a gathering that would be remembered not for its opulence, but for the scandal that would unfold within its gilded walls. As carriages adorned with family crests arrived one by one, depositing their precious cargo of titled ladies and distinguished gentlemen, the air itself seemed to thrum with anticipation. The sound of hooves on stone mixed with the gentle rustling of silk and taffeta, creating a symphony that only London's finest could orchestrate. Inside, servants in pristine livery moved like ghosts through corridors lined with portraits of long-dead ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow every movement with ancestral judgment. Lady Evelyn Winston emerged from her midnight blue carriage, her emerald eyes scanning the scene with the practiced precision of one who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of high society. Known in whispered circles as the Shadow of Mayfair, she possessed an uncanny ability to uncover truths that others desperately sought to bury. Tonight, she sensed something different in the air, a tension that spoke of secrets on the verge of explosion. The ballroom of Pemberton House was a masterpiece of aristocratic excess. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks from the ornate ceiling, their countless prisms casting rainbow fragments across the polished marble floor. Gilt-framed mirrors reflected the scene infinitely, creating the illusion of an endless gathering of London's elite. The walls, draped in ivory silk with gold damask patterns, seemed to pulse with the collective heartbeat of those within. Baron Aldrich Pemberton, the evening's host, stood near the grand fireplace whose mantel bore the family coat of arms, a lion rampant surrounded by oak leaves, symbolizing strength and endurance. His salt and pepper beard was meticulously groomed, and his dark evening attire spoke of understated elegance befitting a man of his position. Yet tonight, there was something different about his usually confident demeanor, a subtle tension that suggested all was not as serene as it appeared. But it was the arrival of Baroness Cordelia Ashworth that truly set the evening's tone. She descended the marble staircase like a vision from a pre-Raphaelite painting, her auburn hair swept into an elaborate chignon adorned with pearls that caught the light with each graceful step. Her gown, a masterpiece of ivory silk with delicate embroidered roses, hugged her figure before flowing into a train that whispered secrets against the marble floor. Yet those who knew how to read the language of society noticed the slight tremor in her gloved hands, the way her sapphire eyes darted nervously across the assembled crowd. The Marquess of Ravenscroft commanded attention simply by existing. Alexander Montague stood near the terrace doors, his commanding presence drawing glances from every unmarried lady in attendance. His midnight black hair was swept back in the fashionable style, revealing sharp cheekbones that could have been carved by Michelangelo himself. The emerald green of his eyes held depths that promised both passion and danger, while his perfectly tailored evening wear emphasized a physique that spoke of countless hours spent fencing and riding. As the evening's festivities commenced, the orchestra struck up a waltz that filled the ballroom with melodies sweet enough to mask the bitter undertones of the drama about to unfold. Couples began to form on the dance floor, their movements as precise and calculated as the social maneuvering that occurred in the spaces between the music. Lady Evelyn positioned herself strategically near a grouping of potted palms, their fronds providing the perfect cover for observation. From this vantage point, she could monitor the entire ballroom while appearing to be merely another elegant guest enjoying the evening's entertainment. Her trained eye caught every meaningful glance, every whispered conversation, every gesture that spoke of secrets beneath the surface. The first indication that this evening would be unlike any other came in the form of a hastily delivered note. A young footman, his face flushed with the urgency of his mission, approached Baroness Ashworth during a lull between dances. The parchment he handed her bore no external markings, but the effect it had upon her was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from her face, as if someone had drawn the very life from her veins, and her hand flew to her throat in a gesture of pure panic. What the assembled guests could not see, but what Lady Evelyn's sharp eyes detected immediately, was the way the Baroness's gaze flew directly to the Marquess of Ravenscroft. For just a moment, their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, and in that instant, an entire conversation passed between them, one of desperate fear, urgent warning, and terrible understanding. The social machinery of the evening continued its relentless march, but those with the wit to observe could sense the shift in atmospheric pressure that presaged a storm. Conversations became more animated, as if the participants sought to fill the growing tension with the sound of their own voices. The ladies' fans moved more rapidly, and the gentlemen's laughter carried a forced quality that suggested nerves stretched thin. As the evening progressed toward its devastating climax, Lady Evelyn noticed other subtle signs of the approaching tempest. Servants moved with unusual urgency, carrying messages between guests with a frequency that suggested communications far more complex than simple social pleasantries. The Marquess excused himself from conversations with increasing regularity, his attention clearly divided between his social obligations and some pressing concern that demanded his focus. But perhaps most telling of all was the behavior of young Lord Timothy Ashworth, the Baroness's own son, whose usually impeccable composure seemed to crack with each passing moment. His hands shook as he raised his champagne glass, and his eyes held the wild look of a man watching his world crumble around him. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the evening's true drama was about to commence. In the shadows between the dancing couples and behind the facade of polite conversation, forces were gathering that would soon explode into the open with the force of a thunderclap. But who could have predicted that the first blow would fall not in the form of an accusation or a revelation, but in the collapse of a woman whose very existence had become unbearable under the weight of her secrets? And what dark truths lay hidden behind the locked doors and closed wardrobes of Pemberton House, waiting for the right moment to emerge and destroy everything in their path? The orchestra's melody seemed to mock the growing tension as it swirled through the ballroom like an elegant lie. Lady Evelyn observed from her strategic position, noting how the evening's careful choreography was beginning to show cracks like fine porcelain under pressure. She had witnessed countless social dramas unfold within these gilded walls, but tonight carried a different energy, one that spoke of revelations that would echo through London's drawing rooms for years to come. Baroness Cordelia Ashworth moved through the crowd with the mechanical precision of a woman fighting to maintain control. Her ivory silk gown, which had appeared so magnificent upon her entrance, now seemed to cling to her form like a shroud. Each step was calculated, each smile forced, as she navigated conversations that felt like verbal minefields. The note she had received continued to burn in her reticule like a coal, its contents searing themselves into her consciousness with each passing moment. The content of that damning missive would have sent shockwaves through any rational person's world. Your secret is known. The arrangement must end tonight, or all of London shall know the truth about your midnight visits to Ravenscroft House. A concerned observer. The elegant script bore no signature, but the implications were clear enough to turn the Baroness's blood to ice water in her veins. Meanwhile, the The Marquess of Ravenscroft found himself trapped in a conversation with the Duke of Wellington's nephew about parliamentary matters, though his mind was clearly elsewhere. His emerald eyes swept the ballroom repeatedly, searching for signs of the danger he sensed approaching like a wolf stalking through a moonlit forest. When his gaze found the Baroness, the silent communication that passed between them spoke volumes about shared secrets and mutual desperation. Lady Evelyn's attention was particularly drawn to the behavior of Mrs. Prudence Whitmore, a woman whose sharp tongue and sharper eyes had earned her a reputation as one of society's most feared gossips. Tonight, however, Mrs. Whitmore seemed unusually restrained, almost cat-like in her observation of the proceedings. She positioned herself near the grand staircase, her pale blue gown and silver hair creating an almost ethereal presence as she watched and waited with the patience of a predator. The first public crack in the evening's facade came when young Lord Timothy approached his mother during the quadrille. The conversation, conducted in urgent whispers behind the cover of a towering floral arrangement, was brief but visibly devastating. Whatever words passed between mother and son caused the Baroness to sway as if struck by an invisible blow, her pearl-adorned fan dropping from nerveless fingers to clatter against the marble floor. The sound, small though it was, seemed to cut through the orchestral music and conversations like a blade. Several nearby guests turned to observe the Baroness's obvious distress, their expressions shifting from polite concern to avid curiosity as they sensed the approach of scandal. In the rigid hierarchy of London society, nothing was more valuable than being witness to another's downfall, particularly when that downfall promised to be spectacular. But the true architect of the evening's destruction remained hidden in plain sight. Lady Evelyn had noticed her early in the evening, a woman of perhaps 40 years, impeccably dressed in deep burgundy silk that complemented her dark hair and olive complexion. She moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of one born to the role, yet there was something in her manner that suggested she was not quite what she appeared to be. This mysterious figure had been making the rounds of the ballroom's most influential guests, engaging in brief but intense conversations that left each participant looking thoughtful and slightly disturbed. Her technique was masterful, a whispered confidence here, a significant glance there, each interaction carefully calculated to plant seeds of suspicion and doubt in the most fertile ground imaginable, the minds of London's social elite. As the evening progressed toward the moment that would change everything, the various threads of intrigue began to weave themselves into a tapestry of inevitable destruction. The Marquess excused himself from yet another conversation and made his way toward the library, his movements casual but purposeful. The Baroness, meanwhile, seemed to be gathering her courage for some decisive action, her jaw set with the determination of a woman who had reached the end of her endurance. The library of Pemberton House was a sanctuary of mahogany and leather, its walls lined floor to ceiling with volumes that spoke of centuries of collected wisdom. Here, among the musty scent of old parchment and the soft glow of oil lamps, the Marquess hoped to find a moment's peace to consider his options. But solitude was not to be his that evening, for he had barely settled into one of the wingback chairs when the door opened to admit an unexpected visitor. Baroness Ashworth entered like a woman walking to her execution, her usually perfect composure finally beginning to crack under the strain of the evening's pressures. The ivory silk of her gown rustled in the silence as she approached, her sapphire eyes bright, with unshed tears that threatened to spill over at any moment. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of months of hidden anguish. "We cannot continue this charade. The note, someone knows about us, about our meetings, about everything." The Marquess rose from his chair, his tall frame seeming to fill the space between the towering bookshelves. His emerald eyes reflected the lamplight as he studied her face, reading the desperation written there in lines of fear and exhaustion. "Cordelia, we discussed this. The discretion has been absolute. No one could possibly." But they do know. The words burst from her lips with the force of a dam breaking. The midnight carriage rides to your estate, the meetings in your private chambers, the gifts, the letters, the promises, all of it. Her voice broke on the final words, and she pressed her gloved hand to her mouth as if she could somehow push the confession back inside. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant strains of music from the ballroom and the soft tick of the mantel clock. In that moment, both understood that their carefully constructed world of secret meetings and hidden passion was crumbling around them like a house built on sand. But what neither realized was that their conversation was not as private as they believed, hidden behind the heavy velvet drapery that concealed the library's second entrance. Another figure stood listening to every word. This silent observer had anticipated this moment, had indeed orchestrated it with the precision of a master conductor directing a symphony of destruction. As the Baroness and Marquess continued their desperate conference, completely unaware of their hidden audience, the pieces of the evening's grand design continued to fall into place. Back in the ballroom, Mrs. Whitmore was beginning to share certain observations with a select group of the most influential gossips in attendance. Each revelation was delivered with the perfect combination of shock and reluctance, as if she were merely a concerned citizen forced to share unpleasant truths for the greater good of society. The whispers began to spread through the ballroom like ripples on a pond, each telling growing more elaborate and scandalous than the last. By the time the story reached the far corners of the gathering, it had transformed from suggestion to certainty, from possibility to established fact. The social machinery of London had begun its relentless work of reputation destruction, and nothing could stop its merciless progress. But the evening's true revelation was yet to come, waiting in the shadows like a serpent coiled to strike. For while the Baroness and Marquess believed themselves to be the evening's primary victims, they had yet to discover that they were merely players in a much larger and more sinister game. What forces had conspired to bring about this moment of reckoning? And what other secrets lay hidden within the walls of Pemberton House, waiting for the right moment to emerge and complete the evening's destruction? The grandfather clock in the corner of the library chimed 11, its resonant tones seeming to count down to some inevitable doom. The Baroness and Marquess remained locked in their desperate conference, unaware that their most private moments were being observed by eyes that had waited months for precisely this opportunity. The hidden figure behind the drapery barely dared to breathe, knowing that the next few minutes would determine the success or failure of an elaborate plan that had been set in motion long before this evening's festivities began. In the ballroom, the social atmosphere had shifted perceptibly. What had begun as an elegant soiree was transforming into something far more predatory as the assembled guests began to sense the approaching scandal like sharks detecting blood in the water. Conversations took on a different quality, voices dropping to more intimate whispers as rumors began their deadly circulation through the crowd. Lady Evelyn noted with professional interest how quickly the transformation occurred. Mrs. Whitmore had positioned herself at the center of a growing circle of society's most influential gossips, her voice carrying just the right note of reluctant concern as she shared her observations about certain recent behaviors she had witnessed. Each word was chosen with surgical precision, designed to plant seeds of suspicion that would grow into certainty in the fertile minds of her audience. "I hesitate to repeat such things," Mrs. Whitmore confided to the assembled ladies, her pale eyes glittering with false reluctance. "But one simply cannot ignore what one has seen with one's own eyes. The midnight carriages arriving at Ravenscroft House, the silhouette in the Marquess's window at the most inappropriate hours, and the jewelry, the jewelry that has appeared around certain necks in recent months. The effect was immediate and devastating. Lady Pemberton's fan snapped shut with an audible crack, while the Duchess of Marlborough's pearls seemed to tighten around her throat as she processed the implications. Within moments, what had been suggestion became accepted fact, and the reputation that Baroness Ashworth had spent years building began to crumble like ancient parchment exposed to flame. But Mrs. Whitmore was not the only architect of the evening's destruction. The mysterious woman in Burgundy continued her own campaign of whispered revelations, moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of one who understood exactly how to manipulate the delicate ecosystem of high society gossip. Her technique was subtly different from Mrs. Whitmore's, where the latter operated with the blunt force of a hammer. This woman wielded her words like a surgeon's scalpel, cutting precisely where the damage would be most effective. Meanwhile, in the library, the Baroness had begun to pace before the fireplace, her ivory silk gown swirling around her like sea foam. The weight of months of deception and fear had finally become unbearable, and the careful control she had maintained for so long was beginning to fracture under the pressure. "You don't understand, Alexander," she said, her voice rising with each word. "This isn't merely about social embarrassment. My husband's political position, Timothy's future prospects, the family name itself, all of it hangs in the balance. One whisper in the wrong ear, one suggestion to the right person, and everything we've worked for will be destroyed." The Marquess moved to intercept her restless pacing, his hands reaching out to grasp her shoulders in a gesture of comfort that spoke of deep familiarity. "Cordelia, we've been careful. Discretion has been our watchword from the beginning. Whatever this mysterious correspondent thinks they know everything." The words exploded from her lips with such force that she seemed to surprise herself. "The letters you've sent, the gifts, the meetings in your private chambers when your staff believed you to be alone. They know about the afternoons when I claimed to be visiting my milliner but instead spent hours in your arms. They know about the promises we've made to each other, the plans we've discussed for a future that can never be." The hidden observer behind the drapery could barely contain their satisfaction at witnessing this confession. Every word was being committed to memory, every gesture noted for future use. The plan was proceeding exactly as anticipated, with the primary players following their roles, as if reading from a predetermined script. But the evening's revelations were far from complete. As the Baroness continued her anguished confession, admitting to months of clandestine meetings and secret correspondence, neither she nor the Marquess noticed the soft sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. The library door, which they had believed to be securely closed, stood slightly ajar, just enough to allow their voices to carry to anyone who might be listening in the hallway. Lady Evelyn had noticed the subtle exodus of key figures from the ballroom and had decided to conduct her own investigation. Her years of navigating London's social labyrinth had taught her to recognize the signs of impending scandal, and tonight every instinct she possessed was screaming that something momentous was about to occur. Moving with the silent grace of her nickname's inspiration, she made her way through the mansion's corridors, following the subtle clues that would lead her to the evening's true drama. The conversation in the library had reached a crescendo of desperation and recrimination. The Baroness's carefully constructed facade had finally collapsed entirely, leaving her as vulnerable and exposed as a butterfly with its wings torn away. Her confession poured forth like water from a broken dam, carrying with it months of accumulated guilt and fear. "I cannot continue this deception," she wept, her gloved hands pressed to her face. "The weight of it is crushing me. Every social engagement becomes an ordeal, every conversation a potential trap. I see suspicion in every glance, accusation in every whisper. The strain is becoming unbearable." The Marquess's response was immediate and passionate. "Then we'll leave London together. We'll go to the continent where no one knows us or cares about our past. We can build a new life, free from the constraints of this suffocating society and its endless judgment." But the Baroness shook her head with the weary resignation of one who had already considered and rejected every possible escape. "You know that's impossible. My son, my obligations, the family estate. I cannot simply disappear into the night like some character from a Gothic novel. The consequences would follow us wherever we went, and eventually they would destroy not only us but everyone we care about. The hidden observer chose this moment to make their presence known, stepping out from behind the concealing drapery with the timing of a seasoned theatrical performer. The figure that emerged was neither the Baroness nor the Marquess had expected, and the shock of recognition sent both reeling as if they had been struck by lightning. How touching! Came a voice that dripped with barely contained venom. Such devoted passion, such star-crossed romance. It almost makes one forget the destruction that such selfish indulgence leaves in its wake. The speaker was revealed to be Lady Margaret Thornfield, the Baroness's own sister-in-law, whose presence in the library at this moment could only mean one thing. The evening's revelations had been orchestrated by someone far closer to home than either lover had imagined possible. Lady Margaret stepped into the lamplight, her severe features made even more forbidding by the shadows that danced across her face. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that emphasized the sharp angles of her cheekbones, and her midnight blue gown gave her the appearance of an avenging angel descended from the heavens to pronounce judgment. "Did you truly believe," she continued, her voice carrying the cold precision of a blade, "that your midnight escapades could continue indefinitely without consequence, that your secret meetings and passionate correspondence would remain hidden forever in a city where gossip travels faster than the Morning Post?" The Baroness swayed as if struck by a physical blow, her face draining of all color as the full implications of her sister-in-law's presence began to sink in. "Margaret, how long have you known?" "Long enough," came the chilling reply. "Long enough to document every meeting, every gift, every passionate letter that passed between you. Long enough to gather the evidence that will ensure your husband learns every sordid detail of your betrayal." But even as this confrontation reached its peak, none of the participants realized that the evening's true surprise was yet to come. For while they had been engaged in their drama of revelation and recrimination, other forces had been moving through the shadows of Pemberton House, preparing to unveil secrets that would make their current crisis seem like a mere prologue to a much larger and more devastating story. What other players remained hidden in the wings of this unfolding drama, and what final revelation would transform this evening from a simple tale of adultery into something far more complex and dangerous. The confrontation in the library had reached a fevered pitch, but even as Lady Margaret savored her moment of triumph, the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor signaled that their private drama was about to become very public indeed. The Baroness seemed to shrink within her ivory silk gown, as if she could somehow disappear into the very fabric itself, while the Marquess moved protectively closer, his emerald eyes blazing with a mixture of defiance and desperation. Lady Evelyn Winston had positioned herself strategically in the hallway, her trained ear catching fragments of the heated conversation within. But she was not the only one drawn to the library by the sound of raised voices. The mysterious woman in burgundy silk had also made her way from the ballroom, her dark eyes glittering with anticipation as she recognized the approach of the evening's climactic moment. "You cannot do this, Margaret," the Baroness pleaded, her voice breaking with desperation. "Think of Timothy, of the family name, of everything that will be destroyed if this becomes public knowledge." Lady Margaret's laugh was as cold and sharp as winter ice. "I am thinking of the family name, dear sister. I'm thinking of how your shameless behavior has already begun to stain our reputation. The whispers have started, the invitations have begun to decline, and all because you chose to indulge your base desires rather than honor your sacred obligations." The Marquis stepped forward, his tall frame radiating barely controlled fury. "Lady Margaret, I will not stand by and allow you to destroy an innocent woman for the sake of your own twisted sense of moral superiority. If you have grievances, direct them toward me. Innocent," the word dripped with scorn, "a married woman who sneaks through the night to meet her lover. who accepts gifts that could support a household for months, who writes passionate letters filled with promises to abandon her family for a life of sin. I think not, my lord. But as the three figures faced off in their triangle of accusation and defense, none noticed the soft creak of the library door as it opened just wide enough to admit another silent observer. This newcomer moved with the practiced stealth of one accustomed to remaining unseen, positioning themselves behind a towering bookshelf where the shadows provided perfect concealment. The conversation continued its devastating course, with Lady Margaret revealing the extent of her surveillance with the methodical precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. She had documented not only the times and locations of the clandestine meetings, but had also intercepted and copied several of the passionate letters that had passed between the lovers. Each revelation struck like a physical blow, gradually breaking down the Baroness's remaining defenses until she stood before them stripped of all pretense. "I have here," Lady Margaret continued, producing a thick packet of papers from her reticule, "copies of 17 letters written in your hand, dear Cordelia, letters that speak of love eternal, of plans to elope to the continent, of a future built on the ashes of your current marriage. Shall I read aloud some of the more passionate passages?" The threat hung in the air like a sword, ready to fall and complete the destruction that had already begun. But before Lady Margaret could make good on her promise, the library door burst open with dramatic force, admitting a figure whose presence changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Lord Richard Ashworth, the Baroness's husband, stood in the doorway like an avenging spirit summoned from the deepest circles of hell. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his gray hair wild, and his face bearing the terrible marks of a man who had just discovered his world was built on lies. Behind him stood young Timothy, whose face bore the same expression of shock and betrayal that seemed to run in the family bloodline. "So it's true," Lord Ashworth said, his voice carrying the quiet deadliness of a man pushed beyond his endurance. "The rumors, the whispers, the pitying glances I've been receiving for weeks. All of it true." The Baroness let out a small cry of anguish and seemed to fold in upon herself, her hands flying to cover her face, as if she could somehow hide from the terrible reality of her husband's presence. The ivory silk of her gown, which had seemed so elegant earlier in the evening, now appeared to mock her with its purity, a virgin white that contrasted sharply with the darkness of her revealed sins. "Richard," she whispered through her fingers, "I can explain." "Explain." The word exploded from him with volcanic force. "Explain how my wife of 20 years has been conducting a passionate affair with one of my closest friends. Explain how she has made me the laughingstock of London society, while I remained blissfully ignorant. Explain how she has destroyed not only our marriage, but the future prospects of our son." The Marquess stepped forward, his sense of honor compelling him to attempt some defense of the woman he loved. "Lord Ashworth, if you must direct your anger toward someone, let it be toward me. I pursued your wife. I convinced her to meet with me. I am the architect of this situation." But Lord Ashworth's fury was beyond such rational deflection. "You dare to speak to me of honor, Ravenscroft? You, who betrayed the trust of friendship and the sacred bonds of marriage. You, who have corrupted my wife and destroyed my family." The confrontation might have continued indefinitely, with accusations flying like arrows in a medieval battle, but it was interrupted by a sound that cut through all the raised voices and passionate recriminations like a blade through silk. The soft but unmistakable sound of a woman's gasp, followed by the rustle of fabric against marble, came from the doorway where several other figures had gathered to witness the unfolding drama. Mrs. Whitmore stood at the front of the small crowd, her pale eyes wide with the satisfaction of one who had correctly predicted disaster. Behind her clustered several other members of London's social elite, their faces bearing expressions of shock, fascination, and barely concealed delight at being present for such a spectacular scandal. But It was the reaction of the Baroness that would be remembered by all who witnessed it. The sight of her private shame being displayed before the very people whose approval she had spent her life courting proved to be the final blow that her already strained nerves could not absorb. Her sapphire eyes rolled back in her head, her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the library floor in a faint so complete that for a moment those present feared she might have suffered something far worse. The sound of her fall, the way her head struck the marble with a sickening crack, the spreading pool of ivory silk around her motionless form, all of it combined to create a tableau so dramatic that it might have been staged by the finest theatrical minds of the age. The room erupted in chaos as people rushed forward to help, others pushed closer to get a better view, and still others simply stood frozen in shock at the sudden turn of events. As the Marquess and Lord Ashworth knelt beside the fallen woman, their enmity temporarily forgotten in the face of her obvious distress, Lady Evelyn noted with her characteristic attention to detail that the evening's surprises were far from over. For in all the confusion and chaos, she had observed something that none of the other witnesses had noticed. The mysterious woman in burgundy silk had not rushed forward to help like the others. Instead, she had taken advantage of the distraction to slip away from the library entirely, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who had accomplished exactly what they had set out to do. But perhaps most intriguingly of all, Lady Evelyn had caught a glimpse of the woman's face in profile as she departed, and that glimpse had revealed something that changed the entire nature of the evening's events. For the mysterious woman was not a stranger to this gathering at all. She was someone whose presence here tonight could only mean that the scandal they had all just witnessed was merely the opening act of a much larger and more complex drama. But what connections bound this woman to the Ashworth family? And what other secrets lay hidden within the walls of Pemberton House, waiting for the right moment to emerge and complete the evening's destruction? As physicians were summoned, and the Baroness was carefully transported to a guest chamber upstairs, the library became the scene of intense speculation and hushed conversations. The fallen woman's dramatic collapse had provided a temporary pause in the evening's revelations, but those with sharp eyes understood that the true drama was far from over. Lady Evelyn remained in the shadows, her mind racing as she processed the implications of what she had observed. The mysterious woman in burgundy silk had not merely disappeared. She had moved with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with Pemberton House's layout. This suggested connections that ran far deeper than a casual acquaintance with London society. As the chaos continued around the unconscious Baroness, Lady Evelyn made a decision that would prove crucial to unraveling the evening's remaining mysteries. Following her instincts and years of experience in navigating the hidden currents of aristocratic intrigue, she excused herself from the concerned crowd and began her own investigation of the mansion's upper floors. Pemberton House was known for its architectural complexity, with hidden passages and concealed chambers that dated back to more turbulent political times, when such features served practical purposes beyond mere curiosity. The burgundy-clad woman's destination became clear as Lady Evelyn followed the soft sound of footsteps up the servants' staircase to the third floor. Here, in a section of the house typically reserved for storage and unused guest chambers, a thin line of light beneath one particular door revealed ongoing activity in what should have been an empty room. Lady Evelyn positioned herself carefully, using the shadows cast by an ornate hallway table to conceal her presence while allowing her to observe through the partially open door. What she saw within that chamber would have shocked even her considerable experience with society's hidden scandals. The room had been transformed into what could only be described as a command center for espionage. Maps of London's social geography covered one wall, with red pins marking the residences of prominent families and lines drawn to indicate relationships, alliances, and enmities. But it was the contents of an open escritoire that truly revealed the scope of the operation. Dozens of letters lay scattered across the desk's surface, not merely the correspondence between the Baroness and Marquess, but communications involving half the prominent families in London. Love letters, business arrangements, political conspiracies, family secrets, all of it carefully catalogued and cross-referenced with the methodical precision of a master blackmailer. The woman in burgundy silk moved through this collection with practiced efficiency, selecting specific documents and arranging them in neat piles. But it was when she turned toward the light that Lady Evelyn finally got a clear view of her face, and the recognition struck like a thunderbolt. Victoria Pemberton, Lord Pemberton's own daughter, who had been presumed to be traveling on the continent for the past 2 years. Her presence here, in this secret chamber filled with London society's most damaging secrets, could only mean that the evening's events had been orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of every family's vulnerabilities. But Victoria was not alone in the chamber. As Lady Evelyn watched, another figure emerged from an adjoining room, a man whose presence explained much about how such an extensive intelligence network could have been established and maintained. Mr. James Blackwood had served as secretary to some of London's most powerful political figures before mysteriously disappearing from society several years prior. His reappearance here suggested that his absence had been strategic rather than accidental. The Ashworth situation is proceeding exactly as planned, Victoria said, her voice carrying none of the cultured accent one would expect from a baron's daughter. The public revelation of the affair will discredit Lord Ashworth's political influence, while the scandal will force young Timothy to withdraw from his engagement to the Pemberton heiress. Mr. Blackwood nodded approvingly as he examined one of the documents, and the Marquess's reputation will be sufficiently damaged to prevent his interference in the parliamentary vote on the East India Company contracts. 3 birds with 1 stone, my dear. The conversation continued, revealing a conspiracy of breathtaking scope and ambition. Victoria Pemberton had spent her supposed exile building a network of informants and gathering compromising information on London's elite. Her goal was not mere social advancement, but political manipulation on a scale that could influence legislation, military contracts, and international trade agreements. The affair between the Baroness and Marquess had been detected early in its development and had been carefully nurtured and manipulated to create maximum damage at precisely the right moment. Anonymous notes had been sent to increase the lovers' paranoia, while strategic leaks had ensured that rumors would begin circulating at exactly the right time to maximize their impact. But as Lady Evelyn absorbed these revelations, she became aware that her own presence had not gone unnoticed. A soft footstep behind her warned of approaching danger, but before she could react, a hand fell firmly on her shoulder. Lady Evelyn Winston, came a familiar voice from the shadows. How very convenient to find you here. The speaker stepped into the dim hallway light, revealing himself to be none other than Lord Pemberton himself. But his expression bore none of the shock or confusion one would expect from a father discovering his daughter's clandestine activities. Instead, his face showed the satisfaction of a man whose carefully laid plans were finally coming to fruition. I must congratulate you on your powers of observation, he continued, his voice carrying a note of genuine admiration. Few would have detected the subtle signs that led you to this discovery. Unfortunately, your timing is rather inconvenient for our purposes. The implications of his words were clear, and Lady Evelyn found herself in a position she had never imagined possible. She who had spent decades observing and chronicling the secrets of others had stumbled into a web of conspiracy that threatened not merely individual reputations, but the very foundations of political power in London. You see, Lord Pemberton explained with the casual tone of a man discussing the weather, tonight's revelations are merely the beginning. The information we've gathered over these past years will allow us to influence everything from military appointments to trade negotiations. A word here, a revelation there, and the most powerful men in England will dance to our tune." But even as he spoke, the sound of raised voices from below indicated that the evening's public drama was far from over. The Baroness's collapse had been dramatic enough, but it appeared that other revelations were about to surface that would make her personal scandals seem insignificant by comparison. For while the aristocratic guests had been focused on the unfolding love triangle, they had failed to notice other movements within Pemberton House. Servants had been carrying messages, documents had been changing hands, and preparations had been made for revelations that would shake the foundations of London society. The question that remained was whether Lady Evelyn would become another victim of this elaborate conspiracy, or whether her discovery of the truth would somehow provide the key to unraveling the entire network of blackmail and manipulation. But first, she would have to survive the next few minutes as Lord Pemberton's guest in a house where secrets were currency and silence was often permanent. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall chimed midnight as the evening's final and most explosive revelation prepared to unfold. Lady Evelyn found herself escorted back toward the main floor by Lord Pemberton, his grip on her arm firm, but not yet threatening. The sounds of commotion from the library suggested that the Baroness's condition was improving, though the same could not be said for her reputation or that of the Marquess. As they descended the grand staircase, Lord Pemberton maintained his casual demeanor, speaking in low tones about the evening's unfortunate turn of events, while his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had orchestrated every dramatic moment with surgical precision. But what he had not anticipated was that his own daughter's operations had attracted attention from quarters he had not expected. The burgundy silk gown that Victoria had worn as her disguise lay abandoned in an upstairs chamber, replaced by the elegant emerald velvet befitting her true station as the Baron's daughter. Her reappearance in the ballroom after an absence of 2 years was causing its own sensation among the assembled guests, many of whom had believed her to be permanently settled on the continent. But the evening's greatest shock was yet to come, and it would emerge from the most unexpected quarter of all. For while the assembled company had been riveted by the dramatic revelations concerning the Baroness and Marquess, they had failed to notice the subtle movements of several key players who had been positioning themselves for the evening's climactic moment. Mrs. Whitmore, her pale eyes glittering with anticipation, had positioned herself near the grand fireplace where her voice would carry most effectively throughout the ballroom. The mysterious collection of documents that Victoria had been organizing upstairs had found their way into her possession through means that spoke of long-established cooperation between the conspirators. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Whitmore announced, her voice cutting through the conversations like a blade through silk. "Before this evening concludes, there is one more matter that demands our attention. A discovery has been made that will, I fear, shock you all far more than the previous revelations." The assembled crowd turned toward her with the fascination of spectators at a public execution, their faces bearing expressions of anticipation mixed with dread. The events of the evening had already provided enough scandal to fuel London's gossip mills for months, but the promise of additional revelations proved irresistible to their appetites for social destruction. "It has come to light," Mrs. Whitmore continued, savoring each word like a fine wine, that the affair between our dear Baroness and the Marquess of Ravenscroft was not the clandestine romance it appeared to be. Rather, it was orchestrated and manipulated by forces that sought to use their passion for darker purposes. Murmurs of confusion rippled through the crowd as the implications of her words began to sink in. The idea that the evening's primary scandal might itself be part of a larger conspiracy was almost too complex for minds already reeling from the night's revelations. But Mrs. Whitmore was not finished with her performance. With the timing of a seasoned actress, she produced a packet of documents from her reticule and began to read selected passages that painted a picture of manipulation and blackmail extending far beyond a simple extramarital affair. Furthermore, she declared, her voice rising with dramatic intensity, The very host of this evening's gathering has been using his position to gather compromising information about London's most prominent families. Information that has been used to influence political decisions, business arrangements, and social alliances for his own considerable profit. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired cannon, and all eyes turned toward Lord Pemberton, who stood frozen on the staircase with Lady Evelyn still at his side. His carefully cultivated expression of shocked innocence might have been convincing under other circumstances, but the weight of documented evidence was beginning to tip the scales of credibility against him. But it was at this moment of maximum tension that the evening's final and most devastating surprise made its appearance. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the ballroom as the locked door to Lord Pemberton's private study burst open, revealing a scene that would be talked about in London's drawing rooms for decades to come. From within the study emerged not one but two figures, their disheveled appearances and obvious panic painting a picture that needed no explanation. The first was Mr. Jonathan Whitmore, Mrs. Whitmore's own husband, whose presence in the locked room at such an hour raised immediate questions about his activities. But it was the identity of his companion that sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Lady Catherine Pemberton, the Baron's wife and hostess of the evening's gathering, stumbled from the study with her elaborate coiffure in complete disarray and her evening gown bearing unmistakable signs of passionate encounter. The contrast between her earlier perfection as the evening's gracious hostess and her current state of dishevelment was so dramatic that several guests gasped audibly. But the revelations were not yet complete. As the crowd processed this new scandal, the Baron's wife discovered in compromising circumstances with another woman's husband, additional figures began to emerge from various concealed locations throughout the house. A young footman appeared from behind a concealing tapestry, his livery disheveled, and his face bearing the guilty expression of one caught in forbidden activities. Two of the evening's guests were discovered in a locked closet in circumstances that suggested their absence from the ballroom had not been spent in innocent conversation. The pattern that emerged was one of systematic deception and manipulation that extended far beyond the original affair between the Baroness and Marquess. Lord Pemberton's house had become a den of intrigue where guests' secrets were discovered, documented, and used for blackmail purposes that extended into the highest levels of government and business. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was yet to come. As the chaos reached its peak and accusations flew like arrows in a medieval siege, a soft knocking sound emerged from an unexpected source. The ornate wardrobe that stood against the wall of the ballroom, a piece of furniture so perfectly positioned that it seemed merely decorative, was producing sounds that suggested occupancy. Lady Evelyn, her journalistic instincts overriding her precarious position as Lord Pemberton's prisoner, was the first to realize the significance of this discovery. The wardrobe was not merely furniture but a hiding place, and someone had been concealed within it throughout the evening's events. The crowd turned as one toward the source of the sounds, their collective attention focused on what promised to be the evening's final revelation. As the wardrobe doors slowly opened, the figure that emerged would complete the picture of deception and manipulation that had been building throughout the night, but who had been hidden within that confined space, observing the evening's events while remaining invisible to the assembled guests. And what final secrets would their emergence reveal about the true nature of the conspiracy that had transformed an elegant soiree into a battlefield of reputation and revenge? The answers to these questions would not only conclude the evening's drama, but would echo through London society for years to come, forever changing the lives of all who had been present to witness the night when secrets became weapons and truth became the most dangerous currency of all. As the wardrobe doors opened fully, revealing the identity of the hidden observer, Lady Evelyn realized that she had been witness to something far more complex and significant than a simple social scandal. Tonight had marked the end of an era of innocence in London society and the beginning of a new age where nothing would ever be quite what it seemed. The figure that stepped from the wardrobe blinking in the sudden light and straightening clothes that had been compressed by hours of concealment, would prove to be the key to understanding everything that had transpired. And their identity would shock even those who thought they had already witnessed the limits of the evening's capacity for revelation. But that revelation, and its implications for all who had played their parts in the night's drama, would transform not only individual lives, but the very foundations upon which London's aristocratic society had been built. For sometimes, the fall of a single house of cards reveals that the entire structure was built on nothing more substantial than shared delusions and collective willingness to ignore uncomfortable truths. Tonight, that willingness had finally reached its limit, and the reckoning had begun.